Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 21st of April of 2025. Today we have a lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Russia, about Moscow, because the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, made a lots of very important statements regarding the truce and the Easter ceasefire. After the Easter truce, hostilities in the special military operation zone resumed. Kiev threatened the Russian initiative as a game of fate. During the truce, more than 5,000 attacks were recorded from the Ukrainian side. Moscow should analyze this experience and also study the feasibility of moratorium on strikes on civilian targets. So as you can see, Putin made very, let's say, important conclusions based on this one-day ceasefire, and most likely the Russians came to conclusion that there should be no trust to the Ukrainians because 5,000 times that's too much. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground. And first, let's talk about the Sumy direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. This evening, we got a lot of updates from pro-Ukrainian sources that something big is happening right now along the entire line of combat contact, that the Russians are bombing and attacking the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine. As for now, we don't have, let's say, geolocations that can confirm additional progress on the ground. The only thing we have is several explosions and several attacks on the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine with the use of FAPs and flamethrower systems. But very likely the Russians continue their offensive. And you know that a lot of things changed in these directions probably for the previous 2 or 3 months, because if you remember, when the talks were just about the Suja and the Suja direction, the length of the front line were around 27 kilometers. So the line of combat contact was located along, let's say, the border between the settlements of Uspienovka, Gordievka and the settlement of Guev and Garnal. So around 27-28 kilometers, and the main clashes were taking place exactly in this area. But after the Ukrainians were forced to fall back from the Suja direction, the Russians increased the border, increased the line of combat contact, and currently the Russians added additional Belgorod direction, and the clashes are taking place on the front line with the lengths of around 70-80 kilometers, which is obviously too much for Ukrainians. As for now, the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack the Russian positions in the Belgorod direction. Today we got additional statements that Ukrainians answered the village of Popovka, made an attempt to answer the village of Popovka and the village of Demidovka, but the Russians reported that they managed to discover all those groups and to attack them, and as a result of Russian attacks, the Ukrainians were forced to fall back. Anyway, once again, maybe tomorrow we're going to start receiving first changes on the ground in the Russian favor on the way to the settlement of Sumy, which is the heart or the center of the Sumy region itself. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Vovchansk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. You know that these days we start receiving more and more updates from the Russian side, and as for the previous 5 days, the Russians were mainly concentrated on attacking Ukrainian logistic bridges, pontoon bridges along the river of Volcha. The Russians continue this process. As for now, we don't see any changes on the ground or any attempts to attack from the Russian side, but due to these activities and due to this concentration of Russian artillery forces and FPV drone forces, we believe that in the very near future the Russians will resume their Vovchansk offensive operation with the purpose to establish complete control over this territory. As for now, it's very difficult to understand what exactly the Russians are planning to do next, whether the Russians are planning to move further in the direction of Kharkiv, or maybe the Russians are planning to attack in the southeastern direction with the purpose to, let's say, to get as close as possible to those Russian units that are currently trying to improve their positions on the Ukrainian side of the river of Oskol. And as for this, the northern Kupyansk direction, as you can see during the previous night, during the previous day, we got lots of updates from this territory. Too many FPV drone attacks. You know that when talking about changes on the ground, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received lots of changes, because during the 20th of April, both the Russians and the Ukrainians managed to improve their positions significantly. They managed to evacuate wounded soldiers, they managed to bring additional forces. So as for the current date, as for the 21st of January of 2025, both the Russians and the Ukrainians were focused mainly on, let's say, destroying positions and destroying vehicles, tanks, ammo, arms that both sides managed to bring to the line of combat contact. So this is the situation, so we shouldn't expect significant changes, but most likely first huge changes we're going to see during the next several days. Also, according to these geolocations, according to this number of geolocations, we see that the Russians intensify their activities in the Kupyansk direction itself with the purpose to outflank and to encircle the city of Kupyansk. In this video, we can see how the Russians were bombing the positions of the armored force of Ukraine between the city of Kupyansk and the village of Kondrashevka with FAP. So we see the Russians are trying to slow down the Ukrainians and not to allow the Ukrainians to bring additional forces along R79 road in the direction of these settlements like Malashapkovka, Tishkenovka and Kondrashovka, where the Russians are advancing and where the Russians are trying to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and to take every single settlement under complete control. So right now there are very heavy clashes for this territory. As for now, the parties are trying to fight for initiative, trying to get the initiative in their hands. Currently the situation is 50-50, but obviously in the very near future the situation will be resolved in someone's favor. Now let's move further and let's talk about probably the most important direction, about the Lyman and Barova directions. As you can see, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions, and once again, the Russians improved their positions significantly. First of all, according to many resources, according first of all to the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, according to several pro-Russian resources, and the most important, according to neutral mappers, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, yesterday managed to finish the clearing of the settlement by the name of Novopavlivka. Based on this report, we have adjusted the map in the Russian favor, and we colored these huge territories under complete Russian control. As for the 21st of April, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, they show almost the same, but with one difference. The Ukrainians believe that the Russians are still fighting, are still attacking the territory of Novopavlivka, and according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the village of Novopavlivka is considered as a contested area or the gray zone. But telling the truth, it doesn't change a lot, because we understand that this, let's say, Lyman or Barova direction is the primary target for the Russians, and even if this village is still in the gray zone or in contested area, obviously the Russians will intensify their activities, they'll increase their pressure with the purpose to take this territory under complete control. Currently, this is the most, let's say, valuable direction for the Russians. And the thing is that the Russians are about to finish their first task, the first big goal, tactical goal in the battle for Lyman and in the battle for Barova. First of all, we have added one important area to this map, this blue, this blue field, this polygon. This blue polygon was added today, and this is the river of by the name of Nitrius. So this is the river of Nitrius, and as you can see, there are lots of water reserves. So this is a very huge, big natural barrier that's located right in the central of the Lyman direction. Basically, this water barrier is very long, first of all, very wide, and this barrier split this territory into basically the Lyman direction itself and, let's say, the Izum or the Oskol direction. So, and we see that the Russians are about to take this territory under complete control. The only thing the Russians left to do is to establish complete control over the settlement of Redkadub and to force the Ukrainians to fall back further in the direction of Glushkinkova, Novy Mir or Maliivka. So to fall back from this territory, this is the main purpose of the Russians, and most likely the Russians will be able to do this during this upcoming week. So something like this is the primary target for the Russians, and they're planning to finish this battle, this, let's say, bridgehead, to establish this foothold, obviously before the May's holidays and before the 9th of May. So what is this, and what this situation will bring the Russians if they're able to establish control over this territory? I'll remind you that we've been talking a lot about this. We've been talking a lot about the third battle of Lyman, and since the beginning of the special military operation, both the Russians and the Ukrainians, when attacking the settlement of Lyman, were using almost the same tactics, during the previous two battles, and we see that the Russians are planning to use the same tactics during the third battle for Lyman. I'll remind you that in 2022, when the special military operation just started, the Russians were attacking the settlement of Lyman from the north. They were moving moving first of all towards to the village of Ritkadub, and after Russians established control over the village of Ritkadub, the Russians began advancing in the southern direction. At the same time, the Russians were supporting offensive operation from the east through the villages of Zarichna and Yampol. So this is the offensive operation from the Russian side in 2022 at the beginning of the special military operation. In the late 2022, the Ukrainians began their Kharkiv counter-offensive operation, and the Ukrainians first were trying to counter-attack the settlement of Lyman through the village of Svyatogorsk, from the settlement of Slaviansk through the village of Seversky Donetsk, but all those attacks, all those counter-attacks from the Ukrainian side were repelled by the Russians. The Ukrainians those days suffered huge losses, and they were forced to fall back and to wait until the group of forces of the armored forces of Ukraine managed to break through the Russian defense through the villages of Izyum, Oskol, and to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Ritkadub. And only then, only after the Ukrainians captured the village of Ritkadub, this is the village that the Russians are fighting for right now, the Ukrainians began advancing from the north in the southern direction, basically facing no resistance from the Russian side. And basically the Russians, after the fall of the village of Ritkadub, were forced to fall back from the settlement of Lyman in the eastern direction, first to the settlement of Zarichna, then to Tarskoye, and then to the village of Dibrova. So we're not talking about the village of Ritkadub as a key region, as a key village in this direction. First of all, we are talking about this water barrier, which is the perfect base, which is the perfect flank, secure the flank when moving in the further in the southern direction. So as you can see, the Russians are about to finish this, and from this foothold, the Russians will be able to move in the southern direction along this river of Nitrius towards the settlement of Lyman, and of course the Russians will be able to move in the northwestern directions towards the settlement of Kiratkovsky. But when talking about the next 6 months, we believe that first of all, and the main priority for the Russians would be the settlement of Lyman. Why is this? And everything is very simple, because if the Russians are able to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Lyman, this is going to be the beginning of huge disaster for the armored forces of Ukraine that are currently located on the territory of the settlement by the name of Siversk. Of course, you can say that what is the difference between 2022 and the 2025, because these territories and the city of Lyman was already captured and controlled by the Russians in 2022, but in 2022 the Russians couldn't do anything with the city of Siversk and the Ukrainian positions there. And you will be completely correct by saying this, but so there is one important difference. In 2022, when the Russians controlled the city of Lyman, the settlement of Yampol, the Ukrainians controlled the settlement of Bakhmut, the Ukrainians controlled the settlement of Solidar, Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, and basically there were no problems for the Ukrainians on the territory of the city of Siversk to supply and support them. And now if we take a look at this configuration of the map, we're going to see that from this perspective, the distance, the shortest distance between the positions of the armored forces of the Russian Federation, let's say in the vicinity of Solidar and on the southern outskirts of the settlement of Yampol, would be less than 20 kilometers. And 20 kilometers using the current technologies and current capabilities of the armored forces of the Russian Federation means the beginning of operational encirclement of the group of forces, Ukraine group of forces on the territory of Siversk and its agglomeration. Just a very simple example. If we go back, for example, to the Sumy direction, once again, I'll remind you that during the active phase, during the highest phase, probably the most hottest phase of the war of clashes for Sudzha and Sudzha agglomeration, the Russians established complete FPV drone control over the main N07 road, and the Russian positions were located between the settlement of Guyeva and the settlement of Uspenovka. So this red line was the territory that the Russians established control over with FPV drones, including the road N07 that goes between the settlements of Sudzha, Yunakiivka and the city of Sumy. And as you can see, 28 kilometers, and these 28 kilometers weren't a big problem for the Russians to establish complete control over this territory with FPV drones that use fiber optic technologies. And we've seen a significant number of videos of death roads, living roads, of semi-truce of the Western weapon, lots of vehicles were destroyed, lots of attacks. Almost every single day, the Ukrainians were suffering hundreds of losses in vehicles just in this pocket. But once again, there are 30 kilometers. But when talking about, for example, this configuration of map, the distance between these 2 points is less than 20 kilometers, which means that the city of Siversk would be caught in cauldron, would be caught in pincers, and the situation for the Ukrainians here would be much more difficult in comparison with the situation for the Ukrainians on the Sumy direction. So this is exactly what the Russians most likely are planning to do, because once again we are coming closer and closer to the major battle, to the battle of the 2025 and probably of the entire special military operation, and we are talking about the battle for the settlements like Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, Konstantinivka, Drushkovka, Kramatorsk, Slaviansk and Siversk. If we summarize the population of all these towns, all these small villages, and so before the beginning of the special military operation, more than 1 million people populated this area. So basically the Russians are trying to attack and to take under control the former agglomeration of more than 1 million people population. Obviously this is the significant, let's say, place, a very difficult place for offensive operation, and this is the area of a major battle that most likely is going to take place in 2025. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Konstantinovka direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. As you can see, after the Easter ceasefire ended, we start receiving lots of updates from this area. Basically the Russians brought hundreds of drones, they established complete control over every single road, they destroy everything, and the Russians are trying to break through the Ukrainian defense and to get as close as possible to the settlement of Konstantinovka from the south and from the southwest. The Russians continue their offensive operation along Seversky Donetsk Donbass Canal, trying to get as many as possible trenches, strongholds in the fortifications, and according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours the Russians managed to answer the settlement by the name of Southern Delivka. Today the Ukrainian sources published the video how they were attacking the Russians in this area. At the same time, the Ukrainians were trying to bring additional reinforcements and reserves along the railways from the city of Konstantinovka towards the southern Delivka, but the Russians ambushed them, and the Russians attacked everything that was moving in the southern direction with the use of FPV drones. So as for now, there are still very heavy clashes. As for now, we have adjusted the map in the area of the northern Delivka in the Russian favor. But for example, today several pro-Ukrainian sources reported that all Russian attacks, the first wave, let's call it like this, the first wave of the Russian attack was repelled by the Ukrainians. There are still very heavy clashes. The Ukrainians are trying to bring additional forces, reinforcements and reserves with the purpose to stabilize the situation. Once again, this is another place where the battle for initiative is ongoing. The Russians are trying to take under control this village, and this will open them the way to attack the northern Delivka, and this is going to be already the beginning of complete collapse of Ukrainian positions in this pocket between the settlement of Nilipovka and the city of Chasiv Yar. So this is also the moment, the turning point in the battle for Konstantinovka and for the major battle. At the same time, the Russians began advancing in the northern direction towards the settlement of Kliban-Byk and Kliban-Bykskaya water reservoir. According to information we have and according to pro-Ukrainian sources, neutral resources and pro-Russian resources, the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to take under complete control the settlement of Sukha, Balka. Maybe just 5 or 10% of this settlement remains under complete Ukrainian control, but we believe that due to this configuration of the map, Ukrainians most likely would be forced to fall back from this area during the upcoming day or upcoming night, because otherwise they would be caught in cauldron. At the same time, the Russians began offensive operation along the railways and along the river of Krivoy Tarets towards the northern part of the settlement of Sherbinovka. The Russians established complete FPV drone control over the northern part of the settlement, where the Ukrainians have the only supply lines to support their forces on the territory of the south and Sherbinovka. The Russians established complete control over this territory, and the Russians are not allowing anything to move from the city of Konstantinovka in the southern direction with the purpose to stabilize the situation. So the battle and the clashes in this area are intensifying every single hour and every single minute. Furthermore, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the Novopavlivka direction. According to different sources, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions, and today, for the first time since the Russians announced that, the Ukrainians confirmed that the village of Preobrazhenka was completely taken by the Russians. Several pro-Russian resources reported that the Russians managed also to answer and to approach the village of Kotlarovka. So the Russians are getting closer and closer to the Dnipro, between the Donetsk and the, let's say, and Dnipro region, and most likely the Russians will try to cross this border, this invisible border, probably before the May holidays that are going to start very soon. Furthermore, the Russians decided to fall back a bit from the settlement of Bagadir, and basically the Russians began everything from the beginning. Most likely after the first attempts and waves to attack the village, the Russians faced the fierce resistance from the Ukrainian side and managed to discover additional positions of the armored forces of Ukraine. The Russians retreated towards the village of Razliv and began bombing and attacking the village once again. In the very near future, probably during the next 48 hours, the Russians will make another attempt to attack this settlement. As for the Zaporozhye direction, the Russians, let's say, are in operational pause. During the previous 24 hours, we haven't received almost anything from this area, despite the fact that Ukrainians reported that the Russians concentrated up to 60 or 80,000 soldiers in this area. We see almost no activities, both neither from the Russian nor from the Ukrainian side. So everybody is waiting for something. Maybe everybody is waiting for Ukraine's decision regarding the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, because we got very important political report that Trump administration this week is awaiting a response by Ukraine to confidential documents shared with senior Ukrainian and European officials during last Thursday's meeting in Paris, attended by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, which detailed a potential ceasefire agreement and concessions to end the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The documents is said to have included a number of concessions that would need to be accepted by Ukraine, including US recognition of Crimea as a territory of Russia, an end to Ukraine's membership ambitions in NATO, as well as the possible establishment of a neutral zone protected by US troops around the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine. So if this is very important, because we see that the United States of America, this is the price that Russia should pay the United States of America to settle this conflict the way the Russians want it. Anyway, let's wait and see. Obviously, this week is going to be very interesting. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye-bye.